Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and we are continuing this evening with our little mini-series that was stimulated first of all by the two lectures that I gave last month on the contribution of Manly Palmer Hall, and we have since then procured and sold just about all the stock that we had on his two books, both of them having to do, one entitled The Secret History and the other one The Secret Destiny of America, which I think are extremely informative and very stimulating. And so, rightly or wrongly, I decided with the occurrence of the 4th of July that we would continue along those lines of the less known or perhaps secret aspects of the foundation in the early history of the United States, and that is what we have done. What needs to be understood, of course, is that it is my contention, and having known him and having been privy to some of his disclosures that were probably not published, I am aware of Mr. Manly Hall's concurrence with this with this narrative, namely that the secret history and the secret destiny of this country were really determined by a appropriately secret tradition which had taken root here at the foundation of the United States, and which was of extremely great importance. In a very subtle psychological mood, Mr. Hall had also stated in those books that there was really originally sort of the concurrence of two elements that had a great deal to do with the spirit of the founders, and that one of these came over from Europe, and that was an ancient tradition. That's the one that I was talking about and will talk about mainly today, but that there was also a receptive spiritual atmosphere of sorts on the American continent and in the territory that became the United States, which had, as we called it then, and I'll call it again now, which had American Indian origins, and that the fraternal associations of at least some of the North American tribes had an underlying kind of mysterious and mystical affinity to the spirit of the fraternal associations who brought the esoteric tradition over the ocean here. And that these two, in some mysterious ways, conjoined and had a great deal to do with the production, and I'll mention a little more about that later, of the, let's say, the underlying spirit of the United States. Now, this is a very interesting notion, and while certainly my knowledge of the Native American scene is much less than that of Mr. Hall, because you know that among his many talents and accomplishments, Mr. Hall was also at one time an archaeologist, and he did some research on the Native American cultures, especially Aztec and Maya, and there is even I think it's an Aztec codex that is in some museum that he discovered, and that is called the Codex Hall. So let's say, he wasn't just whistling Dixie, but let's put it that way, that a very subtle kind of underlying keynote, which was common in some of the no doubt the more advanced and more spiritual elements on the American soil, and those which came over carried by the secret fraternities, Masonic, Rosicrucian, and others, all of which, or most of which, had a Hermetic origin, as I'll tell you before, that these two conjoining created a very, very important spiritual matrix within which the history of the United States could progress. Now, keeping this in mind, obviously our ability to research the exact nature and especially the origins of the Native American traditions which are pertinent to this subject matter are really not open to us. And so we largely rely on the tradition that came over from the old world, and we devoted a certain amount of explanation to that last time, which I only very, very briefly will recall now. And that, of course, being that at a certain point in ancient history, let's say, a physical and historical matrix was created in the Mediterranean area and all the way further down to Asia, which allowed the important elements, the central core of a certain esoteric tradition to travel unimpeded from the east to the west, and to conjoin with traditions that were present there already. So to put that in a little more clearer context, there obviously were esoteric and mystical practices in the Mediterranean area for a very, very long time. And these primarily, what we know of them primarily is what we know of the mysteries, particularly of ancient Greece. Now, this is what in older literature is often referred to as mystery schools, which, as some of you know, is an expression that I don't like, because they were not little red schoolhouses in the Grecian prairie, this was something entirely different. But what these really were, very prominently in Greece, and with perhaps less prominence, but also an incredible power and endurance in Egypt, were the mystery traditions that grew up in the local milieu, and which managed to instruct and train both intellectually and mystically very large numbers of people over a period of time. So that if we take Greece as the example, then we may be assured that for a very, very long time there was always a considerable element in Greece that had been initiated in the mysteries and that possessed a consciousness which was based on their own personal mystical experiences. The very word mystical and mystic comes to us from that milieu, because the mystes, as the Greeks called them, people, it comes from veiling your eyes. But the people who went through the mystery and then experienced that world which one does not see with one's eyes, but one sees it with the inner eye, and these people were the mystes. Now this was a very important element of ancient Mediterranean culture, and allowing for the considerable differences in the cultural environment, some similar developments also took place for a very long period of time in ancient Egypt. So that in the Mediterranean area we had sort of the two poles of mystical consciousness, Egypt and Greece. And we know from the historical and archaeological investigations and studies of both that this method of instruction and of experiential training continued for a very, very long time. It is assumed by the scholars that the Eleusinian mysteries, which are probably one of the best known ones, although you know there were several, that the Eleusinian mysteries had endured for at least 5,000 years. Now that's a terrific length of time in the panorama of history, and with Egypt, of course, things are much more mysterious and much more obscured, but let us say it is to be assumed that the mystical practices which gave rise to particularly the tradition that I will speak about, endured there for an even much longer time. So what did these consist of now? Let's say the mysteries taught those who were initiated into them, and there were the lesser mysteries and the greater mysteries, but they were sort of like a lower class at the university and a higher class at the university. You went from one to the other, had brought the experiential knowledge of another non-material and non-physical reality to a large number of people. We need to remember that the mysteries of Greece, for instance, were open to everybody who wanted to be initiated, and then who then took the instruction from the priesthoods of Eleusis or elsewhere. So over a period of time, a lot of people have had these experiences. So, and I keep repeating this, so I hope I'm not too redundant in saying that there were always two aspects to these practices. One was the internal inspiring and transformative experience of the individual initiate inside, and the other one, let's say a more intellectual and psychological explanation of the context of these experiences that was also imparted to the individual. And these have been referred to in various ways, but probably primarily as the experience and the context of the experience, as we might call them in English. And that these are of extremely great importance. I have again, I'm still haunted by Mr. Hall. I remember specifically Mr. Hall, saying once that he himself had encountered in his career a large number of individuals who had the most impressive interior experiences, and yet derived from them very little or no meaning. So that's the way this sort of thing goes on in our culture. The experience is still possible, but to derive the intended meaning from them, that's a different situation. And I'll just throw in once again that this, of course, also has been the great flaw of the 1960s, with the psychedelic era and all of that there was a lot of experience, but there was no meaning-bestowing context that was available in order to evaluate and to properly internalize, or as the modern world has it, process these experiences. Now then, that being the case, I'm not going to go through what I went through last time again, but let's just say that as these things happen in history, the time came when the mysteries were no longer there and no longer able to practice. The reason for this was, I think, primarily just the passage of time, which brings an end to everything and to everybody, to our occasional chagrin, And so when right around the time when what as in German we call it the Jahreswende, the change of time occurred in the astrological calendar, in the zodiacal ages, and when the Piscean zodiacal age dawned, right around the time of what we call the era AD, or at least I call it that, at that time there arose a need in the Mediterranean area to find a viable substitute and successor to the mysteries which had fallen apart. There were no longer any initiations at Elefsis, there were none elsewhere, and so the time had come to continue with this most important experiential tradition, but in a different way, and also to some extent in a different locale. And in order to accomplish that, a geographical and geopolitical change had to occur not only in the Mediterranean, but from the Mediterranean clear down to Asia, in order to establish the kind of connection which would then allow the movement of people over very large territories to some specific locations where they might experience the essence of the tradition. In other words, the divisions between a whole number of countries had to be loosened or broken down in order for people to be able to move freely onto such places where they might receive the kind of instruction and experience that was the successor to the earlier mysteries. So as the mysteries declined and fell apart, a new situation had to arise wherein their tasks could be fulfilled, and the enlightenment of those humans who were ready for such enlightenment could take place. In order for this to occur, however, there had to be a vast political change that was preceded by a military change. And that is where the one whom I spoke with much feeling last time played such a big role, namely Alexander the Great. It was Alexander's incredible conquests and his incredible military prowess that brought about these geopolitical conditions wherein the successors of the mysteries became now politically available and could do a very important work. And this important work occurred in the city that was founded by Alexander in Egypt, and that of course came to be known and still is known, what's left of it, as Alexandria. So in Alexandria now there arose certain spiritual schools which took the place of the mysteries. We don't really know whether their practices were substantially different from some of the mysteries, to what extent they were related to them, but they were there. And these schools that functioned in Alexandria for around 500 years, were, let's say, the light of the world, and certainly of the Mediterranean world, and the origin of tremendous spiritual developments in the future. There were three main schools of this sort, and we mentioned them before, and I hope that you are not bored by this, but what they were Hermeticism, as they are called by the scholars, Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, and Gnosticism. And all of these, in various ways, were, let's say, combinations of mystical elements or mystical teachings and practices from several sources. So Neoplatonism is easily mentioned because, after all, it was based upon the mystical material in Plato's teachings. It is pretty well agreed upon by scholarship that the great Plato, who was revered not only in antiquity but for a very, very long time, there were actual discussions of leading churchmen, both in the East and in the Western Church, of whether they could declare Plato's writings sacred canon, equal to the Bible. And they almost succeeded. And Plato was never referred to for the next 1,000 years at least by any other epithet but the divine Plato. You see. So let's say that was a very, very important source. It is rumored, and it's probably a likely rumor, that Plato himself, in addition to all of his other activities and accomplishments, was an initiate of the Eleusinian mysteries, very likely. But in any event, from his teachings, there were some wise persons in Alexandria who derived an entire mystical philosophy, which again had both its theoria and its theurgia, because that is the inevitable key to the success of any kind of mystical activity. You see, my good friend and teacher, Professor Ernest Wood, dear gentleman, who lived and taught school in India for well over 20 years, and then I met him when he came back here. Ernest Wood was one to say that thinking only leads to more thinking. And this is, of course, not to discourage people from thinking, because I think that most people, at least most people I encountered in this long life of mine, do much too little and not too much of thinking. It would help people a lot if they knew how to think better. But we must keep in mind that only so much can be accomplished at the level of the thinking function and its associated psychological conditions. So there also always has to be an experience in consciousness, an experience in depth. So if we look at, let's say, the philosophical teachings as being sort of one level of reality, we have to remember that there is another level of reality without which that former level will remain at least relatively ineffective. Now, that doesn't mean that you always have to practice both, like let's say, like at the Eleusinian mysteries, but eventually both teaching and practice have to be present. All right, well, let's see now, just very quickly, Neoplatonism, which was brought into Alexandria by some very brilliant and very famous people, starting with Ammonius Saccas, who started the Neoplatonic school, who was a real strange man. He was a sort of Alexandrian hippie. He worked in the daytime in the harbor of Alexandria, carrying the packages off the ships, for which reason he was called Saccas, the one who carries the sacks. And then in the evening, when his daytime job was accomplished, then he would go to the sort of the big plaza and start speaking. And there he taught what came to be known as the Neoplatonic philosophy. So a real mysterious and mystical prophetic figure. And he was followed by others. He was followed by the great Plotinus, who was really the poet of the Neoplatonists. You know, wonderful, beautiful material. Iamblichus, Porphyrius, and not to be forgotten the great and magnificent lady Hypatia, who was killed by those nice people, the Christians, at a certain point. But you know, still is a long-standing rumor in esoteric circles that her fame survived, literally rebaptized and put in the Christian context as Saint Catherine of Alexandria. after whom Catalina Island off our coast is named. And I love the story of Hypatia. If I get started on that, we won't get around to anything having to do with America. In any event, that was the... Now, there were, of course, the mystical teachings of Plato, and there was the practice. Now, what was the practice? The practice, the theurgy, was the dialogue with and the seeking contact with the gods. Theurgia, the divine work. And so the Neoplatonic context was strictly ancient Grecian and pagan, wherein people would seek interaction and conversation with the gods and the goddesses. If you get a hold of some of the books of the Alexandrian hymns, they have been translated, they all have to do with addressing the gods and the goddesses. And this became, in practical terms, this became the source of what? Of what Eliphas Levi in the 1800s called la magie haute, the high magic. Because it doesn't address crummy little spooks, but it addresses what in modern terms we would call archetypes. It's like Jung was teaching people to interact with and to derive inspiration and transformational energy from the archetypes. Active imagination. So I would say the Neoplatonists were the first people who really practiced active imagination. And they went on for quite a long time, and eventually really morphed into the ceremonial magic of the Middle Ages, which when practiced in a devout and what else we would call it, a clean and high-minded manner, was a very helpful spiritual practice, Neoplatonists. Then, of course, come our friends, the Gnostics, who really arose in part out of the Semitic matrix of Judaism and associated groups, and who, because of that, became allied to the Christian religion. So that, let's say, there was a successor of the mystery schools, which, however, was attached to the prophetic and indeed more than prophetic image of Jesus and of his disciples. That's all that needs to be said about at this time. And there also there's theory and practice. Now we come to the one that's of particular importance and interest to us, and that is the Hermetic. Now, as far as the scholarship knows, and members of the tradition like Manly, Palmer, Hall and others agreed that the origins of the Hermetic tradition were Egyptian. At a certain point after Alexander and so forth, where the contact with Greece became the contact between Greece and Egypt became ever closer, the Egyptian and the Greek pantheon became sort of conjoined and intermingled, and so the Greek Hermes, the god of wisdom, had merged with the Egyptian Thoth of the Egyptian god of wisdom, and so and was often referred to as this combined Greco-Egyptian divine image. Now it is very likely. I would vote for the proposition that there came out of the mists of time of ancient Egypt, there came a mystical practice and theory which was conjoined with thought, and of which thought was, let's say, the mystical patron. You know, the mask, the animal figure of thought is the ibis bird with a big beak. I should have brought my thought. I have a little one at home. Who is the wisdom god who helps Isis to revive Osiris and accomplishing all kinds of other great deeds. Let's say that out of the mysteries of thought, which are veiled, let's say, in the time frame of antiquity, there came a mystical teaching and practice, which became extremely important for a very, very long time for Mediterranean culture, and indeed the other cultural matrices, Germanic and Anglo and ultimately American and French and so forth, because this was the one mystical school that somehow, at least in its essential teachings, continued to have a great deal of influence upon Mediterranean and ultimately Western culture. Now you've got to remember that, Neoplatonism, except for ceremonial magic, which at various times was very popular, it's dramatic and all of that, and if good people practice it, then it will have good results, like so many other things. When nasty people practice something, you have nasty results. So the practitioner is always important. But let's say, that was one. Gnosticism was brutally repressed and remained for the most part underground throughout all of history until in our own time, how lucky we are, right at the closing of World War I, the Nag Hammadi library was discovered, the greatest find of Gnostic Christian writings ever in history, which has brought about a modest Gnostic renaissance, of which actually some of us, including my own self, consider ourselves to be part. There is a Gnostic renaissance that is developing, shall we say. All right, but the Hermetic, for some reason, the Hermetic teachings endured and were available in various ways for a long time. The first availability, let's say the first Hermetic flourishing, of course, was when the Hermeticism was taught in Alexandria. But out of it very rapidly there developed a symbolic discipline, which, you guessed it, had as its material manifestation alchemy. When the Arabs came to Egypt and more or less managed to destroy the existing matrix there about 500 years or so, there were some very curious and very wise people among the Arabs who came, and they they discovered alchemy, and they called it alchem, because of the name that they gave Egypt, the Black Land. And it's black not because of any association of black, but because the black mud left by the river Nile after its annual inundations was the lifeblood of Egypt, and because of the wonderful fertility of portions of the land, because of that, it was the granary of the whole Mediterranean area. The Roman Empire would have starved had it not been for the ability to bring all the grain from Egypt. And so alchem, the Egyptian science, the Egyptian discipline, became the ritual manifestation of the ancient Hermetic philosophy. I think Professor Gilles Quispel, the great Gnostic scholar from Holland, whom it was our pleasure to meet and entertain a couple of times when he came here, he called alchemy the yoga of the Gnostics. Now, he used the term Gnostic in a more loose fashion, just like Jung did. It didn't have to be Valentinus and Basilides and Marcion and so forth. He included, and of course there is a great deal of commonality between Gnosticism and Hermeticism. In any event, there was the alchemical practice, and with it the alchemical philosophy, and at least in my humble or not so humble opinion, that was the seed out of which the several Hermetic revivals ultimately came. So first of all there was alchemy, which is a disguised Hermetic philosophical discipline. In fact, the alchemists were referred to for centuries as philosophers and so forth. Now, however, there was still very little available of the original alchemical, not only of the alchemical teachings were available, because alchemy was practiced, and so there was material added to the alchemical corpus for centuries after that. But the underlying mythos, the deep mythos, the mystical narrative, narrative is the big word nowadays, you know. So the mystical narrative was not really available, only by implication. And then at a certain point, it did become available. And that certain point was a long ways off. It took 1500, almost 1600 years from the time of Christ for the actual concrete scriptural material of Hermeticism to become available. Why this great delay is something that's a matter of conjecture. But we know a few data. One of it was that inasmuch as the Hermetic teachings were present in the Middle Eastern milieu for all that time, the Muslims, the Muslim Arabs who conquered the Middle East, availed themselves of it, even as they availed themselves of alchemy. The first alchemical treatises were discovered by Muslim Arabs and then were translated into Arabic and all things. And so were the Hermetic philosophy and the Hermetic mysticism. And then something happened. The years really don't matter, but I could give them to you. Then the Caliph in Baghdad, see, that's, all kinds of strange things come out of there even nowadays. The Caliph in Baghdad became angry at the Hermetic matrix, and he forbade the copying and the reading and the teaching of the Hermetic books. So the Arabs had the Hermetic books, but at a certain point they were forbidden. And then they began slowly to filter copies of the books, to filter into the European matrix. And so there it was, the end of the Quattrocento and the Quinquecento, the 1400s and the 1500s, the end of the 1400s all of a sudden, these old and wonderful and tremendously exciting Hermetic books began appearing in Italy. They made their way up through Byzantium, up through the Balkans, and then to Italy. And fortunately in Italy there were some very intelligent and very active persons, such as the members of the Medici family, Prince Lorenzo il Magnifico, the magnificent Lorenzo, and the other Medicis, and they said, aha, look at this. The scriptures were in Greek. Look at this. These are Hermetic. These speak of the teachings of Hermes. Stop the press. There was no press, of course, yet. Stop everything, said Lorenzo. And here were his translators in Florence, translating Plato and all of that. Stop. These are the ones we've got to translate. And so they went to work and started and then translated this really very, very voluminous library, again an entire library of Hermetic materials. And if I wanted to bore you, I could read off the various titles, but it's in different segments. In any event, magnificent material in Greek. And with that discovery, all of a sudden something happened. It was as if the cosmic clock had struck. And all of a sudden there was a different intellectual and spiritual breeze that was blowing over old Italy and Rome and everywhere, and it affected the papacy as much as it affected the civilian life, and all of a sudden the Hermetic Renaissance came into existence. So far we have two flourishing of Hermeticism. One in the Alexandrian matrix in Egypt, sometime from around the 2nd century until the 6th century, and then the second flourishing when the Hermetic books became available. And I sort of indicated on my little pet theory that I don't think anybody shares, but I don't care, to the effect that the spirit of Hermes, the spirit of the esoteric tradition, that mysterious mental and spiritual matrix that Alexander liberated and facilitated to come into the Mediterranean area, all of a sudden was reborn. And it is not commonly known in the history books and so forth, but it is undeniable that in the wake of this spiritual infusion, art, literature, poetry, music, everything was flourishing in an unprecedented fashion. Unprecedented fashion, which shows you that if you get hold of the right spiritual inspiration, all kinds of things can happen. When you are without the right spiritual inspiration, nothing happens. And I would venture to suggest that we are a little bit in the second category. Oh yeah, we got a lot of computers, so what? But the really great things, the great and wonderful things which ennoble the soul, which give wings to the mind to soar to the heights, they're not around. I mean, go to the museums. I get sick at my stomach at modern art. Maybe that just stamps me as a certain kind of Yahoo type, but I don't care. Yahoo, you know. But go and to listen to some modern music. It's abominable. It's an invitation to earplugs. That's what it is. Yet not so terribly long ago, we still had really beautiful music, and the music is still available to us because the works of Brahms and Bach and Mozart and Haydn and everybody, these are available, they're just not being used. Why? Well, I would have a few insulting words to say about the why, but I'm not going to. So anyway, you know, the beauty, the artistically elevating elements of the culture are dormant when they are not stimulated by something beyond the world. You see, as there is a famous saying which regrettably I don't recall verbatim of Valentino's, wherein he says how everything depends, one thing depends from the other. And ultimately it depends on the divine realm. And so when there is contact with the divine realm, in gnosis, in a mystical contact, then everything that is at a lesser level is also vitalized and energized and brought to a very good activity. But when there is no contact with the transcendental, when there isn't even any vague general inchoate belief in a supreme, in a transcendental being, in what Jung called the higher power, when none of that exists, then you cannot expect the things that have always resulted from contact with these things to manifest. And an impoverishment sets in. This is the blighted kingdom of the sick Grail king of the Grail legend. That's the one in which we live. So we need a Parsifal. We need the wise Tor, as he is called in German, because the wise fool. Because in a way, Parsifal is a successor of the Tao fool, but he's the wise fool because the things that he seeks are foolishness in the sight of the majority of the people. He still seeks them and ultimately finds them. And when he helps with the healing of the king, then the land heals as well. So here I jumped into the Arthurian myth and into Richard Wagner, all the way from the Renaissance. But let's say I mentioned those things last time. There are definite indications, at least to me, that even in a more direct manner, that the Egyptian element rose in the time of the Renaissance, and that there are all kinds of monuments and historical remnants, especially in the early Renaissance, which indicate an Egyptian influence. And then here were the secret books of the Egyptian Hermeticists. No, all right. So let's say, I think it's very easy to envision that the Renaissance phenomenon at the intellectual and the artistic level was nourished immensely by the discovery, the translation, the study of the Hermetic literature, of things like the Corpus Hermeticum, the Strobius, the Cor Cosmo. I mean, I have not I really should do that, except I don't like numbers, I don't like figures, I never did. I always hated mathematics, and mathematics hated me. But I still had some very tolerant teachers who would pass me, you know. I said, look, you are good at the other subjects, so come on. But let's say I have not compared the number of individual books, tractates as they call them, in the Nag Hammadi collection and in the Hermetic collection. I wonder which one had more, because the Hermetic certainly have many, many, many titles. So in any event, here it was, and it really started something. And then, as I got that far last time, then difficulties arose. And these difficulties, I'm not going to go into too much of it, really were along the religious line, because the northern countries, particularly the Germanic countries and others, let's say, did not have the joie de vivre, the spirit of the Italians. And as such, when people like Martin Luther and others came down to Italy and to Rome, oh my God, I mean, this is Babylon, you know, these people are terrible, everybody has sex with everybody else and doesn't feel guilty about it. You know, will you figure that, you know? I mean, it's one thing to sin and feel guilty, but when you don't feel guilty, that's really terrible. And so forth. And so, let's say the Reformation that came had, I would say, arrested to a considerable extent the second Hermetic Renaissance that I was speaking about. But you know, spiritual things, if that's a bad expression, how can something be spiritual and a thing? But anyway, you know, spiritual things don't go away. You can suppress them, you can push them away. They are a little bit like nature, and because after all it's spiritual nature. And the Romans, who had a saying for everything, you know, had one, naturam expellas furca, tamen usquerit curret. You can chase nature out with a pitchfork, but she'll come right back in again. In the same way, you can chase the spirit out with a pitchfork. You know? Look at the number of Orthodox churches in Moscow alone. There are more than there were under the Tsar, you know. Things like why? Because I tried to chase the spirit out, and it came back. Unfortunately, it takes time. And while the The gods, as the ancients would say, the gods have time, but we don't. And that's very unfortunate, because to wait out the period of the rebirth of some of these important things while they are being repressed and suppressed, and while you have gulags and all kinds of other things, that's difficult to do. I've been waiting for it ever since my teens, and to my great delight and to my thanks to God, my country has become free again and has been reborn. So those things can happen. But let's say the Hermetic Renaissance was impeded in its development at that time. Okay. Now, we actually got that far last time, didn't we? But now the question is that, as I said, the spirit will not lay quiet. The spirit is going to come out sooner or later. So the conditions changed, all kinds of things were going on, the 30-year war, the 100-year war, all the different things, terrible developments in Europe, on the European continent. But eventually something began. And it began in France. And again, I won't go into a great deal of detail, but when it came to the 1700s, middle of the 1700s already, there came about another Hermetic Renaissance. Well, it wasn't called by that name. It was called the Enlightenment, the Erleuchterung in German. And wherever you went, you saw evidence of it. It was a tremendous stimulus to art, to literature, to poetry, to philosophy. Really a great, big development of very great power and great importance. Why it came about, when it came about, and where it came about, I could speculate there, but I don't think it would be all that important. But let me just say this much. The church, that was only the Catholic Church, Roman Catholic, the church damaged itself immensely, not only in connection with the Reformation, but in an entirely different area where there wasn't much Reformation, although the Huguenots came from there, so in France. Because in the Middle Ages, the Church became guilty of two terrible historical events. And one of these was the Albigensian Crusade, 1200s, 1300s, around there, wherein this lovely and very insightful and very wise and very mystical Gnostic church grew up in what is now the south of France, which was then in blood and fire destroyed in a very nasty manner. And another event, not related to that one, but still having a very powerful effect, the persecution of the Templar order in France, the execution of Jacques de Molay and of his officers, and the suppression of the Templar order. Now, why was that also important? Well, first of all, because the Templars brought from the Middle East, from the Holy Land, from the Crusades, brought with them secret traditions, many of them of a Hermetic nature. And this became known, and this was used against them in order to destroy them. And this caused reverberations that went down the centuries. Half of France was wounded. by the results of the Albigensian Crusade, because all the south of France sympathized with the Albigensians or Cathars and could not forget the cruelty of the Inquisition, which was instituted really to persecute the Cathars, and had a grudge against the church, and also to some extent against the kings of France. And on the other side, the French nobility, the French knighthood, all the many children of the great noble families, and all of these people were terribly wounded by the persecution of the Templars. Why? Because all of the second sons and maybe the first, incredible number of the male offspring of the noble families became Templar knights. That was the knighthood. And when that was destroyed, and again in a very cruel and very unpleasant manner, it was not forgotten. It was not forgotten. There's a French legend, and the legends sometimes tell the story better than history. And it was a legend that when the French Revolution was, a reign of terror was flourishing, and believe you me, I hold no good feelings for that, but that's another chapter. But let's see, when that was going on, when King Louis XVI was executed, then a man in a long beard, a mysterious man, got up in the audience, probably in the midst of the tricoteurs, of the ladies who were knitting as the heads were falling down. He got up and said, "This is the revenge of Jacques de Molay." Now, whether this really happened or not, we don't know. But let's say symbolically it's very true that these earlier events took centuries to bear this kind of fruit, then bore a fruit. And now, in the 1700s, the fruit began to ripen, and it was the new, the second Hermetic Renaissance known as the Enlightenment. And obviously the Enlightenment, coming from such places, the Enlightenment had, well, let's put the antagonistic attitude toward the Catholic Church, which certainly manifested in Voltaire, in Rousseau, in various others, but not everywhere. But of course the new Hermeticism spread, and the greatest of the intellectuals of many other countries, Germany, England, as Dame Frances Yates, who wrote about the English Renaissance and about Shakespeare, has pointed out, it was there again reviving and bringing about quite good fruit. Certainly there is no doubt that Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, the Prince of Poets and Poet of Princes in Germany, was a thoroughgoing representative of the new Hermeticism. Every page of the Faust is filled with Hermetic philosophy, so it was everywhere. And of course the spirit of the Enlightenment certainly was in the royal courts, was in the thrones. Voltaire was corresponding with Catherine the Great, with various others. Frederick the Great of Germany, the old Fritz, was a thoroughgoing neo-Hermeticist or Enlightenment figure, and certainly a lot of the results of the Enlightenment were very useful and very beneficent. And not to go into too much detail at this point, let me point out that in the midst of the flourishing of the Enlightenment, there also arose a strange idea. It was present in England, it was present in France, it was others, and that was that there should and there would be built a new entity, a new country. Initially with Thomas More and various people, we foretold as the new Atlantis, wherein this reborn Hermetic philosophy, the spirit of the Enlightenment, could really flourish without carrying, as one puts it nowadays, without carrying the baggage of all the earlier difficulties of history, of crusades and Albigensian crusade and Reformation and all of these things, where somehow the spirit could be free. And it came about. And when the ships arrived, led by the Admiral of the Seven Seas, Christopher Columbus, as Mr. Manly Hall was frequently pointing out, on the sails they bore a symbolic cross, which really has been used in that fashion only once before, and it was the cross of the Templars. So you see, the old things were coming back. This is the place where we are going to find a place where we can be free. We are going to find a place where, even if we follow the impulse of the Templars, or whatever the case may be, where we will be free and we will be able to do things, and we will not carry the weight of the Inquisition, of the oppressions and the misery, religious and secular, of the centuries. And that was the discovery of America. Now, in spite of the Spanish discovery, which of course had a great deal of influence on Central and South America and so forth, the promised land, which was about to be founded, was in North America and was of British, replete with British settlers. And these British settlers, in short order, after doing various things, came to be eventually separated from the mother country. Political and economic disputes arose, and the independence of the United States came into being. Now the leaders of the miscalled, because it shouldn't be called that, the American Revolution, actually the American War of Independence and so forth, were without exception. If you look at their writings, if you look at their speeches, if you look at their deeds, were men of the Enlightenment, which means they were replete with the Hermetic philosophy. Now, I'll tell you in a minute, because time is rushing along with us, as to what were the most important points there. So obviously that was the case. Now what we need to keep in mind, and I put it in the title of this evening's talk, and if I don't mention it, I think I'll be very much remiss. Yes, the leadership of this new movement, the crème de la crème of the people who came here and who were the settlers, who settled the land and who started the new country, were without exception imbued with the Hermetic philosophy. And I say, how could you do that? I mean, they read the Bible and they were promoting religion and all of that. Well, because if you look at and this is really very important, because its possible implications are some that we need to contemplate at the present time. That, yes, Benjamin Franklin particularly, who was the great Enlightenment man, and the rest of them were all very much imbued with and active, let us say, in that Hermetic revival. Benjamin Franklin was as great a modern Hermeticist as any, and many of the others. But they knew that the esoteric tradition is esoteric. You can't make an entire new nation and all the people who are going to live there into Hermeticists, because the esoteric, the Hermetic teachings are not suited for that. And so they said, look, if you do it right, then there you will discover and you'll be able to practice an underlying, there is an underlying compatibility between the neo-Hermeticism of the Enlightenment, between the Enlightened philosophy on the one hand, and regular or so-called Orthodox Christianity. People can believe in the Bible. People can follow their individual churches, whatever they may be, and their teachings. People can respect the Ten Commandments. People can do all of that and still be influenced by and ultimately promoting the cause of the Enlightenment, because these two tendencies are not contradictory to each other. And that, look at, I mean, they wrote their own Bible, the Jefferson Bible. It's a Bible written within the lingo of the Enlightenment. It's certainly not a work of great orthodoxy, but it's compatible. In other words, they felt that you can have a populace of traditional spiritual beliefs and practices, and at the same time you can have a leadership and an overweening cultural atmosphere inspired by the neo-Hermeticism of the Enlightenment, and that this would work. And it worked. Until comparatively recently, I would say, it worked rather well. But there was a fly in the ointment. Big one. Big fly. And that fly in the ointment was Puritanism, a Calvinistic religious philosophy, which was let's say, the truly less desirable branch of the Protestant Reformation. One could generally do business with Martin Luther and his followers, but one couldn't do business with Jean Chauvin, who called himself Johannes Calvinus. And unfortunately, it were these somewhat fringy, somewhat outlying and radical Protestant religious groups that also got the idea, we get on the ships and we'll go over to the new country, and there we will really have a ball in a religious sense. And they did. And, I don't want to put them all into the same bag, but, they were the Pilgrims, a particularly weird, a particularly radical branch of the Puritan others and others. So this became the foil for Franklin and Washington and Jefferson and Madison, because these people were very hard-nosed in their own theological beliefs. So the gentlemen with their beautiful white wigs and the nice long frock coats, I wish that the fashion would go back to something like that. I really would like to wear, at least occasions, a powdered wig. I don't think whether it would make me look good, but it might make me feel good. However, I shouldn't really get hung up on that at this particular moment. But let us say, they said, well, here is the problem. In all the European religious wars, in the 30 Years' War, horrible, horrible thing that just devastated Germany and killed off incredible numbers of people, and the Huguenot wars in France and all of these sorts of things. Those were brought about by the intention of particular religious groups to impose their religion on entire territories. And of course they did. I'm not going to enter any detail, but wherever the Protestants converted a German prince, then that particular duchy or principality became Protestant. And what used to be the Catholic Church now was a Lutheran church and still is. So this is, if we import something like that to the New World, to the United States of America, it's going to go bad with us. We can't have that sort of thing be repeated here in America. So they came up with something that was probably their most brilliant thought. Complete religious freedom. The United States of America was the only country on the face of the earth that had complete religious freedom. You could go to Mississippi and start your own church if you didn't bother anybody, and if you paid your taxes and ran your schools, go ahead and do so. You didn't have that kind of arrangement anywhere on the face of the earth. They were the first ones who did that, and certainly some of the churches were not very happy with it. The Puritans particularly, because the Puritans, the Calvinists, of course, were convinced that they were the salt of the earth and they should run the show in all kinds of ways. But the founders of the United States said, no, not so fast, boys. You've already caused enough trouble back in Europe and things that you're not going to cause it here. So if you are willing to be one of the various other churches, we are not going to have any state-established church, and you abide by our laws and things like that, you're welcome. Build your churches, ring your bells, print your Bibles, do whatever you want to do, but abide by our order and our laws. And with some difficulty and occasional downfall here and there, this happened. But let's say the Puritans were not happy about it, that's for sure. But it worked. And so that was a very important element right there, the total religious freedom and various other freedoms which I'm not going to outline in addition to that. Some having to do with the expression in word and in writing, the free expressions, a free education, and many, many others. very, very important and unique developments which you didn't really have anywhere else on the face of the earth. And this, I think, was a great and a wonderful achievement. Now, what about the Puritans? Well, they weren't happy about this, of course, but, you know, the alchemical principle held true. The alchemical principle of the ballroom that takes two to tango. And so they brought in their own way and in their often somewhat pushy and unpleasant way, they brought some important elements into the country. And you know, they had I have to mention this because otherwise I'll be really, really remiss. The Puritans had an idea, the Calvinist idea, which technically, theologically is called predestination. And the predestination runs like this. God knows everything, okay? Yes, God knows everything. So God knows everything, therefore He knows whether I and you are going to go to heaven or not. He knows it already. So that being the case, what are we going to do? Well, what the Puritans said, what we need to do is find out whether God has decided already, because He has decided already, where we're going to go, up there or down there. Now, how are we going to find that out? Well, they had an idea, because if God has decided that you are going to go to heaven, that means that He already favors you. And therefore, right here on earth, before you die, by and by before you die, as somebody used to say, right now He will favor you. How? You're going to be prosperous. You're going to make money. You're going to be healthy. You're going to be happy. Why? Because God already favors you, and then you're going to go to heaven. That's really a nice arrangement. You're going to have all kinds of goodies right now, and then you go to heaven. How can you miss with that? But this has brought something into the culture that generally wasn't much in cultures then, namely what came to be called the Protestant work ethic. And why was that? Well, we got to show that we are the chosen of God, and therefore that we are going to be successful. But if we don't work real hard, then God is not going to make us successful. So they were basically forcing God to make them rich in order that they can be sure that they are going to go to heaven. That's a little bit of a convoluted reasoning. I have a hard time with that, but that's essentially what it amounted to. And so with their fanaticism and curious wrongheadedness, the Puritans brought the Protestant work ethic into America, which in turn, when you added another century or so, maybe not even quite thereafter, conjoined itself with the phenomenon of the Industrial Revolution and made the United States the most prosperous, the most work-oriented, the most rich country in the world. That's what did it. So you see how alchemy works? The two opposites eventually get together, and when they get together in a peaceful way without killing each other, they can produce phenomenal things. And they did. Because this country, throughout its relatively brief history when compared with other countries, this had a phenomenal history. And in that phenomenal history there are unique elements which are of great importance and which should be recognized and which should be cultivated. I could go through them. Freedom of religion I already mentioned, and the other various freedoms. And by the way, the separation of church and state, which is so frequently misinterpreted, had only one focus. You know what that was? That there would not be an established religion like the Church of England in England, or like the Catholic Church in Italy, or something like that. Not anything else. And therefore, when people invoke the separation of church and state, when somebody is praying in public, or even the prayer in schools, which I thought was a good idea, it was still here when I started going to things like that, then I think they're wrong. That's not what was meant. What was meant was that the state will stay away from religion. It will not declare a religion, it will not favor one religion over the other, and just keep going that way, and be pleasing and permitting toward its people. You want to be a Presbyterian, buddy? Come on, be a Presbyterian. You want to be a Methodist? Come on, be a Methodist. You want to be a Catholic? That was a little more dicey because too many people remembered that there was an Inquisition a while back and things like that. But eventually, with the Irish and Italian immigration and so, that went off too. And so on and so forth. All these freedoms. And of course, which is so often forgotten about under the influence of various cockeyed philosophies that mostly came over from Europe, the freedom to work and to make money. And that is why the United States became, for at least a long period of time, the only country in the world not only to have religious freedom, but to have the freedom to work, the freedom to have what work will be, and to therefore, as the French would say, enrichez-vous, become rich. These things all had to do with the combination of the religious situation and things like that in the country. But I have forgotten one all-important thing. In addition to their practical utility, why were these founders so intent upon religious freedom, economic freedom, educational freedom, freedom of expression, freedom of living? Why? Because they had the cardinal point, the cardinal teaching of the Hermetic philosophy in their soul, that the human is a spirit who was born free and who should remain free. And that combines with all kinds of curious esoteric events that Manly Hall wrote about in something like that, about the strange man in Philadelphia at the signing of the independence who got up and said, America must remain free, America must be free, and impelling the founding fathers to write it. This is why is that? Because the Hermetic, like the Neoplatonic, like the Gnostic philosophy, declares that we are the children of the Most High. And as such, we are entitled to our freedom. We must be free, because if we are not free, then we are not going to return in spirit from where we come. We are not going to realize our own divine potential. That is why we have to be free. And the more of that freedom, the better. This has always been the American view. You know why? And I can tell you that from experience. If once you start allowing your individual freedom to be nibbled away by the state, by the government, by Sacramento, by Washington D.C., or I don't know where else, by Moscow, then you will, bit by bit, you will lose your freedoms. There is no such thing as being unfree in one area of existence and free in another. Once that happens, you're in trouble, and therefore you must guard it. And if you guard it adequately, then things are going to go well. And they have, for the most part, in the history of the United States. So let's be careful. The ultimate raison d'etre of these things is that we are gods in exile, as somebody called them. And as such, we are not only entitled, but we are ordered to be free. That freedom is a divine prerogative. And in deeply hidden away in this body of flesh, there is something divine, there is something transcendental, there is something from out of this world, and this something must be free. It cannot develop, it cannot grow, it cannot achieve gnosis, it cannot fulfill what it needs to fulfill here on earth if it is not free. That's the reason. So there is a transcendental reason behind the freedom orientation of the American Republic. It is not just that Joe Schmo out in the farmer out in Montana or something like that, free to plant, I don't know, carrots instead of turnips. And so it's not a trivial matter. It is something that has a deep relationship to the very heart of everything and to our very heart. And what does that indicate? That we have to be conscious of it, that we have to guard it, that we have to do what we can not to give it up. Because if we do, then not only are we much worse off than we have been before, but we also have betrayed our very deepest nature. We have betrayed the nature of reality. We have betrayed the nature of the spirit by giving up the kind of thing that the spirit should have and that the spirit deserves. So that really tells it all. Those are the fundamentals. That is what really matters. Because if that can be followed and if that can be observed, then everything else will relate itself to that and will ultimately be to our benefit and to the benefit of this strange and mysterious but wonderful entity that was created on the basis of the Hermetic revival, on the basis of the philosophy that people like Franklin and Madison and Washington and so forth adhere to, and which is still important, which is still valid, and this is our greatest heritage. This is our greatest heritage. This is what we have inherited from those who knew more than we know, because they knew what they were doing, they knew why they were organizing the things the way they did. They knew that this keynote of freedom is of extremely great, of crucial significance, and it ought not to be jeopardized. Yes, it ought not to be jeopardized. So we in turn, whether we have come from across the ocean, as I have and some of you have, or whether your parents, or whether your grandparents, or whether you're one of the Mayflower people, or whatever it is, that doesn't really... We all have the same obligation. It's the obligation to contemplate and implement and live these intentionalities of the founders, and not to give them up and not to jeopardize them for anything, because this keynote is not only important, it is all important. It is not only essential, it is all essential. And by us being here, even if we've been here only a few years, or whether we have been here the better part of the century that I have, doesn't really matter. But we owe this kind of allegiance to these principles. And there's not only principles, but they are realities. There is absolutely no political philosophy, there is absolutely no other kind of philosophy, no teaching, no interpretation of history that can deny this. And therefore, we must be conscious of it. What we are not conscious of, says Carl Jung, is not going to happen. If we are conscious of something, there might still be difficulties, but it might happen. And consciousness, awareness, allegiance to that which is important and which is real are all important, all important. Nothing is more important, and they should not be made to be subservient to any other consideration. And maybe if we know a little bit as to why these things exist, why they have been brought here, why they have been implemented, we'll have an easier time dealing with them and adhering to them and bring them to the victory that they deserve. And so I thank you once again very much, and God bless America.